Hi, this is Jan Fries. I did my paper on John Hinckley Jr. John Hinckley Jr. was a 25-year-old young man who attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan back in March of 1981. He ambushed Reagan outside a Washington, D.C. hotel. He was armed with a .22 caliber handgun. He emptied the entire contents of the handgun toward President Reagan as he was exiting the hotel after a speaking engagement. He struck Reagan and 3 others in the process of the shooting. The entire thing was captured by the news media who was covering Reagan's schedule at the time. Hinckley was immediately taken into custody. He was questioned extensively by Secret Service, FBI, as well as a court-appointed psychiatrist immediately after the shooting. 3 days after the shooting, he appeared in court for his preliminary hearing. At that time, the court-appointed psychiatrist presented his findings on Hinckley and declared he was competent to stand trial. He was able to assist his counsel with his own defense. The judge accepted that report, and Hinckley was remanded into custody to a federal psychiatric hospital, basically, where he was ordered to undergo more evaluation and testing. This was because the defense counsel had raised the possibility or probability that they would be pleading not guilty by reason of insanity to his crimes. After 4.5 months, Hinckley appeared again before a judge at his indictment hearing, and at that time he was indicted with 3 federal counts as well as 10 local Washington, D.C. counts. Now, this is significant at this point because the judge had to decide what jurisdiction the trial was going to be held under, either federal or local Washington, D.C. The difference in jurisdiction is critical because both jurisdictions have different guidelines when it comes to the not guilty by reason of insanity defense. While both use the model penal code standard test, the federal jurisdiction required the prosecution with the burden of proof, as far as they had to prove that the defendant was sane at the time of the crime. If they'd gone with the Washington, D.C. jurisdiction, in Washington, the defendant bore the burden of proof of proving that the client was insane. So the judge decided federal standards, so they went forward under the model penal code test and with the burden of proof on the prosecution. Now at trial, and the trial got underway late April 1982, so almost a year later. At trial, prosecution, the crux of their case was Hinckley is not insane at all. The lead psychiatrist for the case said that he was not psychotic in any way. He was basically characterized him as a lazy, spoiled rich kid who was seeking fame, and that's why he committed the crime. The defense, on the other hand, presented experts that stated that Hinckley was schizophrenic and was suffering from a severe depressive disorder. Their evidence consisted of these interviews and also the writings of Hinckley in the almost 5 years actually before this incident. He kept diaries, he wrote music, he wrote letters, he wrote poems, and he had this delusion that he was obsessed with the actress Jodie Foster in the movie Taxi Driver. And he envisioned himself as the Travis Bickle character, Robert De Niro's character in that movie. He sort of took on that persona. He did stalk Jodie Foster. He, when she was a student at Yale, sent her letters, phone calls, enrolled in a class there, tried to meet her. He was convinced that if Jodie Foster could only acknowledge him and see him, that she would fall madly in love with him. So the defense, brought forth all this testimony. His parents also testified that they attempted to considered having Hinckley institutionalized prior to the shooting incident. They got him help from a local psychiatrist. They went to say, hey, do you think we should have our son committed? And that psychiatrist said, no, don't institutionalize him. He treated him with biofeedback techniques. He also recommended that the Hinckleys cut him off financially and kick him out of the house so that he would be forced to stand on his own 2 feet and kind of grow up. So the Hinckleys took his advice, and that's what they did. They kicked him out, and 5 months later, he attempted to assassinate the president. The trial lasted for over 7 weeks. During that trial, if you look at the court transcript, there's over 1,700 pages of court transcripts that relate directly to psychologists and psychiatric testimony. So that's quite a bit. The jury took 3 days to render their verdict. The judge, after summation, he gave these instructions to the jury regarding the not guilty by reason of insanity plea. The first was reasonable doubt, and he said if the prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Hinckley was sane, then the jury would have to find him insane. And then if they had to think of, did Hinckley, because of his mental illness, if he was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his crime or conform his conduct, then also they would have to find him insane. And he also reminded the jury that if they did come back with a not guilty by reason of insanity plea, that Hinckley would be placed in a secure psychiatric hospital, and he would not be released until he was determined by the courts that he was no longer a danger to himself or others. So with these instructions, after the 3 days of deliberation, the jury came back and found him not guilty by reason of insanity on all 13 counts. The backlash was immediate from the public. Everyone was very upset that someone could try to assassinate the president, have it all captured on film, and basically get off, is what the news accounts all characterized it as. Within 30 days, Congress started to have hearings on to reform the use of the insanity defense at the federal level. And what they came up with in 1984 was they passed the Insanity Defense Reform Act, which still is in play today. It's considered a modified form of the model penal code. It's more of a retreat to the McNaughton standard, and emphasizes more does the defendant know right from wrong, without the, can he conform his actions part added on to there. It also no longer mental disease or defect alone is not a defense for a crime, basically. And then they shifted the burden of proof from the prosecution to the defendant. So the defendant now had to prove the insanity rather than having the prosecution prove someone sane. And also what was important about this Insanity Defense Reform Act regarding forensic psychology is that it limited how expert witnesses can be used at trial. We learned about how they should not testify to the ultimate issue, and that's where this Reform Act, that's where that came from. Basically, a psychiatrist can testify whether they can evaluate whether the actions and behaviors of their client or the person they're interviewing indicates a mental disorder, but they can't say whether this means he's sane or insane. So that's what's called testifying to the ultimate issue. They're not supposed to do that. Many states, more than half, enacted reforms at the same time. A lot of them flipped the burden of proof over to the defendant's side. 6 of them changed to this new modified model penal code rule, and some reverted actually back to McNaughton rule or a version of the McNaughton rule. Currently, there's only 10 states that still put the burden of on the prosecution to prove sanity. 4 states have totally abolished the not guilty by reason of insanity, and only 1 state, New Hampshire, still uses the Durham rule. So the Durham rule states basically that anyone can use the insanity defense if they're declared mentally ill. But anyway, so all these changes happened, and they're still with us today. That's why this case is very important in forensic psychology. Thanks.